really about space exploration at the time. It was really to say, look how far my rockets can go. Right? So it was much more about the sort of display of power than it was really about space. So I think, I think the space race at the time is often mischaracterized as for what it actually was. And then, as you've already mentioned, I think the sort of extent to which commercial actors are now involved in the realm of space, but also, the sheer diversification of actors that we've seen. It's not just two superpowers sort of pitched against each other now. It's a much different environment that we're seeing. It's much more complicated. There's a whole other host of factors now involved when we look at competition in space. And I think we can talk about competition, but I do think that the sort of second space race analogy is not quite fitting, even though obviously for the headlines, it's sort of the draw.
It's a catchy title.
So Elise, what's your outside context moment for this episode?
So my outside context moment, and bear with me for our listeners who are very much more in the digital finance world, because this one's going to go a little off-piste. So my outside context moment comes from a book that I read recently called Cold Magic, and it is essentially a revisionist history about a post-Roman Empire world and what would happen in that context if there was different factions, kind of more of a sort of steampunk crossed with magic world. But the important thing to note here is that, like, throughout the whole book, they keep talking about what happened to the Roman Empire, how it impacted where they got to, the mistakes that were made. But really, the crucial question here and what stuck out to me is, at what point does an empire stop being an empire? But then also, at what point do the people of that empire realize that they're no longer an empire? Because when you are an empire in that context, you have the control over the world, the entitlement that comes with that, the influence that you wield, and that when you are a true empire, you genuinely do wield that. But when that falls away, that ceases to exist. But quite often, people realize that much later than the empire actually falls. And so my outside context moment was extracting that to our modern world. And if we look at the different empires and global giants and leaders and jurisdictions that we've had in any field, not just tech, I think it will be interesting to watch over the next few years, because arguably there are a few jurisdictions which will cease to become as powerful as they once were, and we'll see new global leaders take the stage. I think that's increasingly evident in the times of kind of geopolitical change that we're seeing. And so that's my outside context moment for the week, is one to watch on the rise and fall of empires.
I think we're going to need to go for a drink and discuss that one a lot.
Contact me if anyone has any questions or wants to hear my views on which empires are next to rise and fall. But that's probably content for enough of a whole episode. But what's your outside context moment, Jannah?
So following on from our intro to the last episode with Dante, when we were talking about war and how war incentivizes and leads to technological progress. And I mentioned Century Reign by Alistair Reynolds, where this formed an integral plot point. And that inspired me to go and reread Century Reign by Alistair Reynolds. And I do read more than Alistair Reynolds, I promise, I do. But there was another really interesting reference in the book that I hadn't picked up before. And so in the book, there are humans have divided into two factions: the slashers, who embrace technology to the point of integrating it into their bodies, and the threshers, who use technology but refuse to undergo such merging. And in the book, one character is at some point explaining the history of the slashers and where their name came from. And the character says, back in the early days of the first kind of networked global system,
where we are now.
Internet, yeah, wow. There was a group of people, a community, for whom their symbol was a slash and a dot. And that, of course, is a reference to Slashdot, the website that was launched in 1997 with the tagline "News for Nerds, Stuff That Matters," one which has been very close to the heart of anyone who's been around the computer science department or worked as a software developer, as well as a much larger community of tech fans as well. Slashdot is still growing strong. I think it's dropped the tagline, but it's still there, and it's still, you know, got very active forums discussing everything from climate change to AI to the next iteration of Java, as you'd expect. But this made me think about these communities that have been forming over the years, and these sort of tribal identities that people are finding. And in the modern world, you know, a community like the Slashdot community transcends borders, transcends most of the common identifying markers of people, and yet most people who are on Slashdot share a fairly consistent worldview. They're very pro-free speech, quite socially liberal, quite driven by a thirst for scientific knowledge and a dedication to the scientific method, and generally quite forward-thinking tech geeks, in summary. But again, you know, when we think about the way that empires have formed over previous years, or civilizations have formed, they've been geographically co-located, and now we're looking at these, you know, quite strong, quite cohesive,
Decentralized communities,
yes,
one might say.
decentralized, one might say, decentralized communities forming. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see if that does, you know, turn out to be a future model for society at a more global level, and whether that will lead to that kind of political factionalism in a way that's defined more broadly than just our geographical proximity.
Well, I mean, and linking right in with my outside context moment as well, perhaps the empires of the future won't be drawn along the same lines. So, with that, let's get into our episode. We have an absolutely great one for you guys today. But before we go into that, I have to say, news for nerds, stuff that matters, also fits very nicely with this podcast. Let's get into it.
So with that, welcome back to the Outside Context. Today, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Juliana to talk about an area that Jannah and I are extremely interested in, but not at all experts in. We are going to be talking about space security, outer space security, and arms control. Juliana, can you please introduce yourself, your work, tell us how you got started in this career, because I think it will be quite different to a lot of people that Jannah and I typically speak to in financial services. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And thank you for including space security as part of your series. So thank you. Yeah, my name's Juliana Suess, and I'm an associate with the STAN team. So that's the Strategic Threat Analysis and Nuclear Disorder team within the International Security team at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And I just joined the team here in Berlin. And before that, I was the research fellow for space security at RUSI in London. RUSI is the Royal United Services Institute. And that's actually where I started working on space security just about 3 years ago in 2021. And it was quite interesting because at the time they were hiring for the position of a research analyst to work on space. And specifically, I think there was a focus on, you know, finding someone who can explain space and someone who perhaps does not come from a sort of physics or astronomy background, and sort of being able to actually communicate what space security does and is and how important it is, and being able to, you know, speak to industry, speak to, you know, the political and the military world as well, and being able to communicate that. So me, with my, you know, politics and IR background, I was like, this is great for me because I do not have a physics degree. And I think for the last 3 years, having worked on space security in that world, there's so many people working on it with similar backgrounds to mine, you know, international relations, you know, plenty of people also who've previously done arms control. So I think it's important to stress that even though obviously space is also a STEM subject, and a lot of people associate it with, you know, the hard sciences of maths and physics and astronomy and the like. We also definitely need people who come from all sorts of different backgrounds and who can sort of communicate that topic perhaps in less sort of hard numbers terms. So delighted to have been part of that, or to be part of that world now. And yeah, absolutely, further social scientists, humanitarian background people do join the space community.
I feel like in that sense, bringing it back to digital finance where Elise and I are today, space policy and space security is almost one of those areas where you're not born into it because it is such a, nascent area. Everyone has a unique journey and path to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely not something I would have imagined I'd be doing when I was, applying for my politics international relations degree. But again,
don't worry. Same here. Who would have thought my political science, French, and history would land me working on digital currencies? It really did not have that on my bingo card for my adult life at all.
I think that's a great thing, right? That as you sort of progress in your career, you kind of, get to know different topics and different subjects and just different jobs that people do. I think there's something really nice about that, having that flexibility.
So back on the subject of space security, Juliana, what do we mean when we talk about space security, and what's the current state of the space security landscape? Some of the main considerations. What's keeping you going every day?
I mean, it's a huge remit, to be honest. But whenever I sort of try to break it down for people who hear about it the first time, because I think space security can seem quite an elusive subject, and I always say essentially there's two sides to it. One side is how the military, for example, already interacts with space assets. For example, our reliance on satellites, all the different military capabilities that space enables, if you're thinking about communications, navigation, for example, just to name a few of the big ones. But then there's also the other side, and that is space as an environment in and of itself, and the vulnerability of space assets, space systems that we see as a result of being so, ubiquitous and so just how necessary they are, specifically also for military capability. So I also do spend time looking into counter space capabilities, whether it's anti-satellite weapons, for example, or more temporary measures, jamming or spoofing of signals, perhaps, which I'm sure we'll get into later on in our discussion. But so those are really the two sort of big overarching themes that I work at.
And I think that's so fascinating because it actually mirrors a lot of what we see in other kind of counter threat initiatives around the world. And, Jannah and I, and I'm sure a lot of other people as well, have been kind of watching developments in the broader geopolitical context over the past few months. There's certainly so much going on. I mean, with the advent of, things like Starlink related to, the war in Ukraine and other developments around the world, space is kind of seen as being an increasingly critical piece of this puzzle. And so I guess it would be helpful to hear from your perspective where space actually sits in that geopolitical landscape. So who are really the main players, and also what are their motivations? Because you mentioned it from a resource perspective as well, not just a threat perspective. So it'd be great to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you already mentioned some of the sort of crucial factors that we're now considering. And I think if we're looking at the geopolitical realities, that we see every day, I think it's important to remember that space is not separate from that. And that basically the geopolitical competition that we see, the ambitions of states that we see, all of that is projected into space as well. And, one might even argue that it's perhaps a little bit harder to hide in space, because as soon as you've launched a satellite, it is sort of there for all to see. And I think certainly the war in Ukraine has certainly placed space in a new spotlight, even though obviously space has been used for military purposes for a really long time. We think about, for example, the navigation services that were used during the Gulf War, in the 90s, just as one example. But I think the spotlight is really on space now, specifically because of Starlink, as you've already mentioned. But yeah, I think the diversification of actors in this space that we've seen is really something that characterizes the, what some people like to call the current space age. Because I think when we think about space security, I think a lot of people cast their mind back to the Cold War and they think about the space race, right? And there's all these sort of headlines that we see now about the new space race, analogy that I don't think is quite fitting to what we're actually seeing today. And I think, yeah, part of that is just the diversity of actors that are now in the field. Obviously, we still have big nations, rich nations that are engaging in space. Certainly we've also seen China entering space, and China really developing more and more space capabilities and really having that as a big ambition as part of its sort of greater ambitions as a nation. But also increasingly how the commercial world has sort of really, I would argue, caught up with states on this. We've definitely seen how even space launch has become much cheaper since the 1990s. So it's a lot easier now, even for startups, for example, universities, to launch assets into space, to have their own space systems. And that's what we generally consider new space. So that's the increasing commercialization that we're seeing of the domain. But obviously that comes with its own developments and sort of how the space is perceived and how the space needs to be regulated. It's just becoming, no pun intended, it's becoming more crowded up there. So I think it's certainly a development that we need to follow more closely.
You mentioned that you disagreed with the characterization of what's going on now on the geopolitical landscape and the entrance of new actors to space exploration as a new space race, in the same sense as the Cold War, kind of more of a space arms race in a way, I guess. Why is that? Is it due to this greater focus on commercialization?
Yeah, I think that's one aspect. I think also sort of going back to, and listeners can't see this, but in inverted commas, the space race at the time during the Cold War. Not my words, but the wise words of Melissa Hannam, who's an expert in missile defense. When she speaks about the space race, she was like, it was a missile race, right? It wasn't really about space exploration at the time. It was really to say, look how far my rockets can go, right? So it was much more about the sort of display of power than it was really about space. So I think, I think the space race at the time is often mischaracterized as for what it actually was. And then, as you've already mentioned, I think the sort of extent to which commercial actors are now involved in the realm of space, but also, the sheer diversification of actors that we've seen. It's not just two superpowers sort of pitched against each other now. It's a much different environment that we're seeing. It's much more complicated. There's a whole other host of factors now involved when we look at competition in space. And I think we can talk about competition, but I do think that the sort of second space race analogy is not quite fitting, even though obviously for the headlines, it's sort of the draw.
It's a catchy title.
Exactly.
It's a catchy title. And it's funny as well, because even in kind of our world, people use the words digital space race all the time to sort of characterize the race to become a digital hub. But I do think that, even though, to your point, that's maybe not always quite so accurate, there are some interesting parallels to the digital world, especially in considering, a lot of these technologies may have originally been developed either by governments or for government usage, now are becoming increasingly private. There's a number of new players on the scene, topic of a different podcast. But when you think about even things like stable coins versus central bank digital currencies, these are all kind of very interesting parallels to looking at, the private and public space developments too. But I do want to come back quickly, because you mentioned obviously that it's not an arms race anymore. Totally fair. But obviously space still matters a lot for the military. So what are, moving from those, could you talk about first those historical drivers? So you were saying, the missile arms race, but then moving to current examples of military interventions or uses of space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big historical driver at the time was the sheer sort of military usage that could be drawn from space. I mean, we have documents back from the 40s, even in the States, and that sort of discuss, space could be used for military purposes. And obviously at the time, the thinking wasn't, as developed and as evolved as it is now, because it was simply a different kind of warfare that was fought at the time. Or different character of warfare, I should say. But, space was always associated with this display of power. And obviously, back in the Cold War, one of the first uses of satellites was Earth observation and reconnaissance, and being able to say, being able to keep an eye on missile salvos, for example. We've definitely come some way from that, but, the reconnaissance that we gain from satellites is still incredibly important, because these days not only do we get optical images, so satellite images, but we also get radar images as well that work despite whatever level of cloud cover there may be, or whatever weather conditions there may be. So things have definitely become much more developed since then. And I think obviously our reliance and our dependency on these assets has grown as a result. It becomes more and more as these things become more and more evolved, so does our dependence grow. Navigation, for example, and the timing signals that we gain from navigation satellites, for example, that can be used for weapon systems, but that are also obviously used to sort of locate troops, for example. And then also satellite communications, which is a huge one, right? If we're thinking about ships, if we're thinking about planes, any sort of beyond line of sight communications, a lot of that these days is carried through satellites. And then obviously, back to the Cold War, so to speak, early warning sensors that are in space and that can sort of detect the launch of ballistic missiles as well.
I think that's super interesting that, while the space, the development of space and technology in space was driven by direct defense concerns, we're now seeing this increased civilian dependence on space, or dependence on satellites, and for civilian purposes. But that in turn creates its own vulnerabilities, because as a society and economically, we're now so dependent on this connectedness, on the data that we receive from satellites, and the connectedness that satellites give us on broadcasts and things like that, that we're incredibly vulnerable to their disruption. And that in turn creates, although it's through a civilian pathway, or the civilian usage pathway, almost as significant concerns when it comes to national security, I guess. So what are your thoughts on that? And what are some of the, the vulnerabilities that exist, for us, that people should potentially be a little bit more aware of, and be considering in terms of operational risk and resilience and things like that?
I mean, I'll be the first person to put up my hand and say I did not realize how dependent we were on space until I started working on it in 2021. So I'm very guilty of this myself. But I do think generally there's just not enough awareness of how dependent we are on space. As you mentioned, it's now linked to so many different things that we rely on daily. Whether it's checking when the next bus is coming, whether it's checking, where the next metro station is, but also bank transactions, certain internet providers. There's all these interdependencies now that I think quite often go unnoticed because simply space is usually working, right? Or communication satellites, I mentioned earlier, military communications, but obviously that does also extend to the civil realm. So for example, there was a collision between two satellites back in 2009, and obviously 15 years ago we weren't quite as sort of interlinked with space and internet, etc., as we are now. But even then, that collision caused an outage of certain communication services in the US for quite some time until it could be fixed and patched up. So I think other than these, I would argue so far relatively small incidents, we haven't really seen the extent to which we are reliant on space. And obviously, that does also make things more complicated. Obviously, we do use space for national security purposes, and we do use it for civil purposes. So if there's ever an attack against a space asset that may be motivated as a result of geopolitics or a conflict or a war that's going on, but the civil side will ultimately also sort of feel the effects of that and suffer as a result.
And you mentioned you mentioned satellite collisions, and I remember reading a few years ago about and encountering the Kessler syndrome for the first time. The idea that you know, satellite collisions and increased space debris could lead to a point where actually we're unable to leave the Earth because space debris like flies around very, very quickly and actually can be incredibly damaging. And bringing it back to the sci-fi origins of the Outside Context podcast reminded me of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in which Douglas Adams describes the planet Cricket, which a bomb goes off in space above Cricket and fills the immediate space above it with dust that obscures its view of the universe and essentially cuts it off from the universe. And so, you know, with things, challenges like space debris, how are they being addressed at the moment? And do you think that there's sufficient emphasis being placed on them? I mean, having even Elon Musk having, you know, all those Starlink satellites up there in geosynchronous orbit must be getting pretty crowded, and the risk of these events happening must be increasing over time. So how's that being managed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's so many questions attached to that. I do want to do one quick correction, if I may. But Starlink's actually in lower Earth orbit, so it's the orbit that's closest to us. Which does mean there's a little bit more space for those satellites, but obviously low Earth orbit is also currently the place to be, right? If you're a new and upcoming space actor, more than likely your assets are in low Earth orbit because it gives you sort of better connectivity, or faster connectivity, I should say, and also and that actually brings me right on to your question. So, for example, low Earth orbit, the frequencies that you inhabit as a constellation, for example, they are managed, but not the actual sort of slots that you sit in, because low Earth orbit doesn't have sort of specific pathways. So in a way, it's a little bit of a free-for-all, as long as you sort of hand in your licenses and you get assigned the sort of specific frequencies in which you can operate. But the actual space that you operate in, the physical space, is not assigned. And you already mentioned the Kessler syndrome. So that's pretty much what we're worried about, right? We're worried about basically a domino effect in space where, you know, for example, two satellites collide, or perhaps even one satellite sort of breaks up as a result of an internal combustion, or, you know, whatever other event that renders it unmaneuverable. And that basically will follow a sort of domino effect whereby space debris begets more space debris as things cannot be maneuvered anymore, as it might become harder to sort of avoid the sort of clusters of debris. And obviously, a Kessler syndrome itself that's just a phenomenon of the domino effect. That doesn't necessarily mean that the whole orbit becomes, you know, just a sort of ring of debris and cannot be accessed, but that is the worst case scenario, is that we are no longer able to access certain orbits, or that we basically cannot operate safely in that orbit. That's the Kessler syndrome. And that's also obviously what we're worried about in terms of any potential kinetic attacks against satellites, is that perhaps they do create sort of such big clusters of debris that the orbit becomes much, much riskier to operate. And I did say earlier about, you know, the effects that can be felt, whether it's civil or military satellites. Obviously, you know, they do have, there's separate satellites for these, but that doesn't mean that an attack on a satellite may not also have indiscriminate effects on other satellites, such as civil ones.
So, okay, this is, I mean, in some ways very concerning, in a lot of ways very fascinating, and thank you for clarifying that. But to bring a parallel back to what I may assume maybe our sort of financial services listeners, obviously for things that we don't want to go very, very wrong or collapse or blow up in the financial system, we have quite a lot of regulators who look after that. We have a lot of people who are very concerned about financial stability, about market crashes, about making sure that financial stability is managed both on a jurisdictional level and on a global level. To the point we were discussing earlier about all of the sort of privatization and the independent initiatives which are happening, which of course deliver many, many, many consumer benefits. And I think that that is very clear, and you know, it's amazing to see the advancements that have happened. But it does sort of seem like those decisions, to me at least, as an outsider looking in, are being taken somewhat independently of each other. And there doesn't seem to be a sort of financial space stability board or a Basel committee of space, which I'm not necessarily saying that's what we need. But I would love your perspective on how the decisions that are being made now, potentially by these independent corporations or governments, who's kind of looking over those? How is the policy being shaped? And also, if I'm right and there isn't that sort of convening power, how might those decisions then actually impact our future world, depending on who is the kind of dominant player in space?
Yeah, you're right. So in general, I think we are definitely seeing still some, spaces within space that aren't sort of as governed as we are sort of used to with other industries. And sort of to go back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the slots that are given. So we do have the International Telecommunications Union, which is a UN body, and they give out those frequency slots, and they then also dictate to the constellation managers, whether it's a company or whether it's a nation, and they say, this many satellites or, that percentage of your constellation needs to be up in space by that point in time. Otherwise, we will revoke your license. So, there are rules and laws about what you can actually sort of bring up into space and in what time frame. And for example, for the geostationary orbit, which is the orbit that's furthest away from the planet, so that's at 36,000 kilometers away, and that gets much more crowded because we're sort of seeing a belt right across, and that means you have sort of physical slots that are given away. So that is much more regulated in that sense. But also what we just talked about sort of in terms of space debris and trying to avoid space debris, much of that is still largely down to the operators. So for example, say you have a satellite constellation, and obviously, everyone operates through, algorithms these days, and, you can kind of, you obviously track your satellites to make sure they're still on the right path and they're still covering the areas you want them to cover. And you might say, oh, actually, it looks like our satellite will collide with satellite from another constellation in about 12 hours time if they both maintain the same course. Now, there's no central body you can then go to ask to fix this, right? So what has to happen is you then have to call the other company and say, hey, looks like we're going to have a collision in 12 hours. Who's going to move? And there's a pretty good chance that either the other company will not pick up the phone, right? Think sort of Friday afternoon scenarios. But also, there's a good chance that they say, well, our algorithm doesn't say that we will collide. So actually, we won't move because for us, there's no risk. So because everyone uses different algorithms and everyone has different systems, there's nothing that's sort of centrally managed to avoid this.
This is giving me very strong Red Rising trilogy vibes of the Space War games, but I do want to keep us back to the real world and not fully off topic. Perhaps we could have a fully separate podcast episode on Red Rising and current parallels, which I'm very into at the moment. However, I do want to kind of then, bring it back to our discussion of what's happening in space today. And maybe let's think about how that will evolve to further in the future. So we've obviously talked about the civilian and we've talked about the military aspect. Is there a chance that the military focus that to date has kind of determined a lot of space exploration? To your point, it motivated a lot of the early space race. Could that impact then the direction that human expansion into space and off planet takes in coming decades and centuries?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, we use space for a whole host of, different things that we need for everyday life. And obviously, we have to remember it's the same environment that all these things sit in. So, for example, if you sort of remember the anti-satellite weapon test that was conducted by Russia back in 2021, it was a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon. So, simply put, it's a missile sort of launched from Earth that then destroys a satellite in low Earth orbit. Now, the debris that test produced actually endangered the International Space Station for, quite a few turns around the Earth. So, in low Earth orbit, and the ISS basically, does one full turn every 90 minutes or so. So basically, while that debris, that's not going to immediately sort of dissipate. So basically, the ISS had to, for lack of a better word, sort of ride through that cluster of debris multiple times, which obviously put all the astronauts and all the cosmonauts on board. So, the Russian trained astronauts that were on board in danger. And, the test was conducted by a state that also had its own citizens in low Earth at the time. So I think that's a very sort of stark example that we just saw, 3 years ago. But I think it does give us an indication of, this is a shared space that we do need to look after. So we've been talking about space security this whole time, but also space safety, whether it's debris, whether it's solar flares, it is all the same shared space. And we do need to keep that in mind in terms of how we operate, whether it's in a civil or whether it's in a military sort of way. We are going to continue to need space for all of the above. So we need to make sure it's, as risk-free an environment as it can be. And, already at the starting point, it's not a risk-free environment, right? So there's lots to be kept in mind. And of course, I think, the way that we handle space will obviously also impact space exploration and further missions.
I like what you said there about, already as a starting point, space is not a risk-free environment, because it's, we've talked a lot about the kind of more manageable risks. So risks within our own control. Like if we screw this up, if, 2 satellites crash, that is to some extent a risk that we can manage ourselves, albeit one that could perhaps be better managed, as you've pointed out, in practice. But there are lots of risks, again, given space is inherently a risky place to be, that are outside of our control as humans. And like Carrington events, for example, I was pretty horrified when I read about them. The last one, I think, was in the 1800s. So basically a solar event that led to all sort of electricity production being knocked out over a significant part of North America and impacting the rest of the world as well, back in the 1800s. And that took some months to recover from. And these are things that do happen on a reasonably cyclical basis, I think. And, were we to have one today, that would obviously have a far more significant impact. How do, in your space, in your sector, how do you guys, address these sorts of risks? Do you just look at them on more of a kind of here's how we manage the fallout, so detection and then sort of recovery? Or do you also look at ways that perhaps how the damage can be limited as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's only so much that's within our control effectively. So solar flares, for example, as you mentioned, when they come up, we do obviously have to worry about space assets, and specifically, for example, at the point of launch when they're sort of most vulnerable. So we did have an event, and I think it was last year, where there was a launch of Starlink satellites, and usually they get launched at about a batch of 40 or so satellites. And they were launched despite sort of warnings about high solar activity, and actually the whole batch was lost. As a result, I think maybe perhaps 1 or 2 survived, but I think that was about it. So I think it's about the management of risk effectively, and that's the sort of one of the few things where it's really purely about the safety rather than safety security sort of blend. That is those are factors that are completely outside of our human control. But it's about how do we what do we do with the assets at that time? Obviously, it would have been safer, for example, in that scenario for SpaceX to hold off on the launch for another week, but perhaps, their calculations said that it should have been fine. And perhaps there was enough of a risk appetite to say, even if we lose this batch, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, there were clearly, I would imagine, conversations that were had in advance, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It's, there are things that are outside of our control, where we can really only try to make our space systems more resilient and making sure that there's redundancies in place should these things happen. And obviously, there's only a certain extent to which we can do that.
I guess my question was a little bit broader than that. It was, these events have a potential to have, again, a massive knock-on impact at their most severe on our societies and economies, given our high dependence on space. And perhaps a little bit outside of your immediate scope, but in your view, I guess, what would, how should we be managing those risks at a sort of global level or individual country level, where we can, foreseeably have these massive outages that result from space-related events? Should we be reducing our dependence on space? That doesn't really seem feasible. Should we be planning for more, alternatives and backups and things like that? What do you think is the severity of this risk, or the likelihood of these risks crystallizing even?
It's a great question, because actually, you said it's sort of slightly out of my remit, and I would agree, but I think it's something that we think about in the defense world all the time, right? Because at the end of the day, the consequences are the same, whether or not a satellite gets knocked out sort of as a result of military action, or whether it gets knocked out because of a solar flare. So, these resilience and redundancy questions pop up all the time. And I think, as you say, the reduction of sort of space dependency at this point is almost, it's not entirely impossible, but I think we've slightly sort of, we've come too far to be able to do that entirely. So I think, at least in military terms, we sort of always speak of sort of fallback options, and having, making satellites more resilient, whether it's against sort of human attacks, but also obviously environmental factors. So, for example, if we're looking at especially sort of highly sensitive military assets that are also in space for a long time, all of them will be radiation hardened. Not just in the case of a sort of electromagnetic pulse sort of weapon that could be deployed, but also because obviously in space you don't have the atmosphere protecting you, so there's a lot more radiation. You obviously want your assets to last as long as they can. So there's a sort of resilience of the asset itself, but then there's also the resilience of the structure in which they sit in. Say that communication satellite no longer works because of whatever reason, environmental or sort of in a war scenario. What other sort of fallback options do I have to hand? And I think to a degree that also needs to include terrestrial options. If, knock on wood, but let's say the entire GPS constellation suffers as a result of, whatever we've discussed, we need to have some kind of fallback that allows us to say, okay, plan A is no longer feasible, but we have plan B, or we have plan C even. And that doesn't mean necessarily having the whole sort of being able to operate in a sort of normal setting, but at least having certain options that allow us to retain at least some level of operability for sure. So there's a whole host of things that you can do, and specifically when we're talking about navigation, for example, there's certain navies now that make sure that they teach their recruits how to navigate again with the sort of compass and the stars, because they're like, well, what if your navigation system no longer works as a result of jamming, for example, the disruption of signals? You need to be able to fall back, even if it's onto the very, very basics.
And one thing I love about what you were just saying there is so many of these terms, like thinking about resilience, thinking about interoperability, thinking about, the long-term future proofing. I'm like, these are the things that we talk about too. And it's so interesting to me that these are core themes. We often think of them across like digital finance, but actually these are core themes across the development of tech in general. And I absolutely love that. But okay, I do want to then wrap up with something fun. We love to ask our guests this question because, honestly, nobody's probably going to be listening to this podcast in 500 years. But if they are, in the context of your specific focus areas, what do you think is the future of civilization in space? And this does not have to be confined to this planet. Where do you think we'll be in 200 to 500 years from now? And what are your kind of best, but also maybe worst case scenarios? Feel free to get as creative as you want. Views your own.
so much scope, especially when you say best and worst case scenario. I mean, I think in 500 years' time, I don't think it's completely unreasonable to say there will probably be a multi-planetary, at least sort of, two-planet civilization. I don't think that's out of the question anymore. I think worst case scenario is that we sort of don't treat the next planet, so that we treat it even worse, or the same level as bad as we treat the current one. I think best case scenario, we have some lessons learned, and I know that there's a lot of discussion in the space world about the sort of ethical questions around sort of entering other planets. If we're thinking about material that goes up to Mars, for example, there's only a certain amount of sort of outside bacteria. I mean, virtually none that is allowed to be on the assets that go on Mars. For the Moon, already they're already kind of missed the boat on that one. It's already littered with stuff that we brought up there. So it's really interesting to see those sort of standards. But yeah, I think best case scenario is that we use these technologies for the better. But I think especially if we're looking into who those kind of travels will be accessible to, I think there's also obviously the danger of a sort of increasing sort of divergence of those who can afford to and those who can't, and sort of what in turn is sort of left there. I think we are definitely going to see, and it's already starting, right? We're already seeing sort of industries or economic industries that think about space increasingly, like asteroid mining, for example. That sounds very sci-fi, but it's actually already sort of starting to happen. The only thing that's preventing it from being a sort of established thing at the moment is that simply it costs so much to get up there and get the stuff back down. There's currently not really a market for these kind of materials, but that might change if we become a multiplanetary species, right? Because at that point, everyone will have to travel for everything. So that's kind of my best and worst case scenario, sort of mixed together in one slightly incoherent answer. But
no, no, it's great. It's great. And I mean, I guess what I'm hearing is best, we learn from our mistakes on this planet, and worst is that we don't and destroy this one and another one in the process. If I've characterized that correctly.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Juliana. It's been really great having you on here. And I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure all our listeners have as well. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.